Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. Today, I have another fantastic guest whose work I admire greatly, Hugo Mercier. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. Let me just mention a few elements from your bio. You're a cognitive scientist at the Jean-Nicot Institute and a permanent scientist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. Your
hmm
main areas of research are human reasoning and the evaluation of communicated information, which maps exactly on your two books, which
hmm
is the latest book, 2020, Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. I don't have yet a physical copy, so I can't show
Yeah.
it. But the other one, I do have a physical copy, and it's even cited in my last book,
Yeah.
The Enigma of Reason, unbelievable book with
Thank
Dan
you.
Sperber. Did I cover the key highlights of your bio? Or is there anything you want to add?
That's perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. And as I told you offline, people love it when I speak in one of the other languages. So, if I may, in French, je m'excuse du fait que l'Argentine a détruit l'équipe nationale de la
Détruit, mais
France.
pas du tout. C'était les tirs au but, c'était pas du tout.
Bon, et est-ce que je peux présumer que si je viens vous visiter à Nantes, il va y avoir des billets pour le match Nantes-PSG et vous allez m'inviter au match? Oui?
Alors, je suis pas un grand fan de foot. Moi-même, je suis plutôt le rugby. Donc, à l'automne, il y aura la Coupe du Monde de rugby. Donc, on peut essayer d'aller voir des matchs de la Coupe du Monde de rugby.
Okay, I just for those of you who don't speak French, I first offered my apology for Argentina. All of you know that I'm a huge Lionel Messi fan, for Argentina defeating France. And then I asked Hugo, who lives in Nantes, whether we can go see a game of Nantes versus Paris Saint-Germain, which is where Lionel Messi plays in his club. And he said, very surprisingly, that he's not much of a fan of soccer, but of rugby. I didn't even know that that was possible for a French person to not love soccer more than anything. But okay, are we ready?
Yes, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I'd like to do, this is maybe the third time on my show that I mentioned this quote. It's a quote by Leon Festinger that actually I quote. Leon Festinger, for those of you who don't know, is the pioneer of theory of cognitive dissonance. And in chapter 7 of the parasitic mind, where I'm talking about how to seek truth, and then right after that quote, I get into the enigma of reason by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. Here's a quote that I'd like to read to you because I think it perfectly distills your theory of argumentation, Hugo. You ready?
Mhm.
So here we go. So this is from Leon Festinger. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. We have all experienced the futility of trying to change a strong conviction, especially if the convinced person has some investment in his belief. We are familiar with the variety of ingenious defenses with which people protect their convictions, managing to keep them unscathed through the most devastating attacks. But man's resourcefulness goes beyond simply protecting a belief. Suppose an individual believes something with his whole heart. Suppose further that he has a commitment to this belief, that he has taken irrevocable actions because of it. Finally, suppose that he is presented with evidence, unequivocal and undeniable evidence that his belief is wrong. What will happen? The individual will frequently emerge not only unshaken, but even more convinced of the truth of his beliefs than ever before. Indeed, he may even show a new fervor about convincing and converting other people to his views. End of quote. Doesn't that perfectly distill, in a sense, what you're talking about in the Enigma of Reason?
No, it does do that to a great extent. Yeah, and it's a lovely quote, and it's a good prelude to, I guess, what is the his book about the that sect that was holding doomsday beliefs. But we also actually in the book we also stress the fact that people do change their minds, like when they are confronted with good enough arguments, and when the stakes are maybe not that high, they do change their minds. But even there's this example I love that we cite in the book of people who have extremely strong convictions, and then yet when they heard the right argument, they all completely change their minds. And it's the story of at the beginning of the 20th century, some of the greatest minds in Western philosophy and logic and mathematics were trying to build, to keep things kind of simple, we're trying to build logical foundations for mathematics. So you have, Bertrand Russell, David Hilbert, Whitehead. And these people have devoted their lives to that project. They have written, thousands of pages of the Principia Mathematica for Russell and Whitehead. It's all consuming. It's really like something they've devoted everything they could do to that project. And then at some point, they read Kurt Gödel's proof, his incompleteness theorem, and right away they're like, okay, we're wrong, we can't do it. And they drop everything at once. It was like, it's hard to imagine something that could be more deeply valued to someone, someone who had sunk more energy into doing something than this. And yet, because the proof was irrefutable and these people were clever, indeed extremely smart, they couldn't escape its logic. And because of it, they immediately accepted the conclusion.
I love that I mean, I have a mathematics background, so I love that you gave that specific example, which kind of in a way segues, but I don't want to get there yet, to something that you've been studying, I think more recently, intellectual humility, which I want to get back to. So in a sense, they were exhibiting the ultimate manifestation of intellectual humility, because it had great personal cost to them to say, oh yeah, I'm wrong, you're right. And yet they were able to do it like the good dispensers of truth that they were. But
yep.
Before we get to that, I want to continue a bit on the enigma of reason. So, of course, for those of you who don't know, you are very much of all of your work is very much rooted in an understanding of the evolutionary roots of our cognition, our behaviors, and our emotional system, and so on. So, in the enigma of reason, you argue that we didn't evolve this kind of domain general capacity to seek truth, but rather we evolved this reasoning capacity to win arguments. Maybe tell us a bit more about that from an evolutionary perspective, and then
No, thanks. Yeah. So from an evolutionary perspective, the standard view of reason doesn't make much sense, I think. So the standard view of reason that has been defended by people, in a way, you can find that in Descartes already, and nowadays you find that in all the proponents of kind of dual system processes, such as Danny Kahneman and many others. And in this classical or kind of individualistic view of reason, the function of reason would be to correct mistakes that the rest of the mind does. So you have this dual system, something that's also kind of popularized by Jonathan Haidt. You have most of your intuitions and your emotions, things that happen quickly and unconsciously and without much effort, that work well most of the time, but that are kind of prone to making systematic mistakes, studied by Kahneman and Mercier and many others. And then you have this system to reason that is supposed to be like the rational actor who can count things down and weigh the pros and cons and correct your intuitions and your mistaken intuitions. And the issue with that view is that from an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't really explain why humans would be the only ones to be able to reason. I think if it's such a great ability, then everybody should be able to do it. And it's also not clear how it's even possible in the first place to have one cognitive mechanism that would be able to know better than all the other ones. It seems as if the natural way for evolution to do that would be to just improve on these mechanisms that tend to make mistakes, instead of having this kind of semi God homunculus who can fix everything. And so we don't think that this classical view is very plausible. There's also a ton of evidence that it just doesn't work. For instance, one of the most striking traits, and that is kind of very well evidenced traits of human reason, is that it has a my-side bias, or what people often call a confirmation bias. So whenever you're looking for reasons, you tend to find reasons that will support whatever you think was right. And that's what, the Festinger quote you were citing, relays very well. And that bias is, I think, completely incompatible with this kind of individualistic view of reason, in the sense that if you had a well-designed mechanism to help fix your intuitions, then clearly you don't want it to start from the point that your intuitions are correct and you're just going to justify them. That's the opposite of what you want to do. And so to replace this view, Dan and I have developed an alternative, which we believe is much more kind of solidly grounded in evolutionary theory. And in this alternative, reasoning would have two main functions. One of them is to find justifications. So in the evolutionary rationale is as follows. We know that humans cooperate to a great extent, and much more than other primates, for instance. And to cooperate, we have to constantly gauge the traits of other people. We have to figure out who is honest, who is nice, who is benevolent, who is
You said
competent, you know.
copulate?
No, no, no. To evaluate the reputation of others.
Oh, sorry. Okay, okay,
No, no,
gotcha.
no. Yeah, we also have to copulate, but
Okay.
that's all.
Yes.
And we also anyway. Um, and so, and the problem is that oftentimes it's hard for people to know, you know, why we're doing the things that we do. And so we might do things that might look bad, that might look like we're doing something that is morally dubious or that is a bit stupid. And then thankfully we can justify our actions to others. So, you know, for instance, if I had shown up late for the recording, I could have told you, well, look, you know, my son was sick or something. I could have told you why I was late in such a way that you don't hold me, you know, accountable. You don't think less of me for being late. So that's, according to us, one of the functions of reason. And the other comes with communication. So one of the other big human characteristic is that we are very, very good at communicating, much better than other primates. And the issue with communication in an evolutionary context is that we can't just trust others because other people might have different incentives from ours. And so you have to evaluate what they tell you, which is, you know, something we'll probably revisit later. And one of the ways of evaluating what people tell us and deciding whether they're right or not is that they can give you arguments, and then you can evaluate these arguments. And so in our theory, reason would have evolved both to produce justifications, to justify our beliefs and our decisions, and reasons to convince others, and also to evaluate the reasons and justifications and arguments that others give us, so we can know whether we should change our mind or not.
Got you. Now, is there a psychometric test that is able to differentiate across individuals the extent to which I use my reasoning abilities in the way that you're suggesting? Or is this something that is invariant across all people? We all have 10 toes and 10 fingers. Everybody uses reasoning for the exact same purpose. There aren't much of individual differences on that trait.
So there will be individual differences clearly in the proclivity to do it. You know, there are people who really like arguing with others, even about, you know, topics that are of no great kind of personal relevance. And most, you know, academics obviously fall in that category. And there are people who just don't like that so much. Obviously, you'll have differences of ability. Like in every cognitive trait, you have people who are a bit better than others at it. But our assumption or kind of our hypothesis is that this is an evolved cognitive mechanism. And if you grow up in a normally developing, you know, if you're normally developing and you have a standard environment, everybody will have, you know, everybody's reason will work broadly in the same manner.
Got
And
you.
indeed, so for instance, like we've done experiments. We have a set of experiments showing that very small children are able to evaluate arguments and to discriminate between kind of very strong and very weak arguments, at least. And they can probably do better, but at least this is what we've shown. And we've shown that that was equally the case for kind of small scale populations in Guatemala. And these populations are interesting because essentially, you know, kind of rich people in the West are the only people who really talk to their children a lot, except to tell them to do things. And so, you know, we give them reasons. We, oh, you can't do this because of that, and you know, we justify our actions, and nowhere else in the world do people do that. And so, in that community, kids are mostly exposed to imperatives from adults. Adults tell them what to do, and that's it. And so they have, in some sense, a slightly impoverished environment in terms of exposure to reasons and arguments, and yet they had exactly the same ability to discriminate between good and bad arguments than people than kids in Switzerland or in France did.
Beautiful. So this actually is a nice segue to the next question, because you mentioned, so, you know, you're doing research in developmental psychology where you can kind of address some of these innate mechanisms, and you're also doing it cross-culturally, which of course is another part of the toolbox of, you know, evolutionary psychologists not succumbing to the weird bias and so on. Which leads me to, so in the same chapter, the parasitic mind, in chapter 7, where I quoted the Festinger quote, I talk about nomological networks of cumulative evidence, right? The idea, and so you might remember the wonderful paper by Schmidt and Pilcher, where they, you know, introduce, you know, here is an adaptive argument that I'm trying to make, and now I'm going to generate these distinct lines of evidence coming from across cultures, across time periods, across methodologies, across frameworks, all of which will serve as a, epistemological triangulation on steroids to demonstrate the veracity of my position. And so I developed that argument in that chapter. And so there, what I'm assuming is that as long as you don't go, la, 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 I don't want to hear what you're saying, as long as you've got the intellectual humility to at least be open to me hitting you with my nomological network of cumulative evidence, that I can hopefully convince you. But then the reason why I use your work, so I think you know where I'm going, but then you're coming along and saying, well, wait a second, you can give me all the tsunami of evidence that you want to prove that I am wrong. My reasoning capacity did not evolve to actually listen with an open mind to your nomological network. I'm not going to listen. So does that become an impenetrable, intractable problem because most people are going to go, la, 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 I don't want to
No,
hear.
I think actually, so by default, people should be quite open. Like we think that one of the functions of reason is it's not only to produce reasons to convince others, and then when it produces reason, we should be biased because it makes sense. I mentioned earlier the confirmation bias or the my side bias. And if my goal is to convince you, then clearly I want to mostly find reasons for my point of view or against yours. But we also predict that people should actually be relatively open-minded and relatively objective when it comes to evaluating other people's arguments. And so we think that reason itself does a good job of that. But there are many other things that can get in the way. And in particular, and that's what kind of Festinger studied a lot, for instance, there are kind of social constraints that mean that in many cases, when we are socially committed to a point of view and everybody knows we hold that point of view and we've done actions based on that point of view, there will be a cost to changing our minds. We might think you're a flip-flopper, they might think that you're unreliable, especially because in many cases, people won't know why you change your mind. They just see that you've changed your mind, but they don't know that you had a good reason to do so. And so, I think, yeah, people, they have the ability to do it. There's actually this one quote that I don't know by heart, but I really like by Martin Luther, the theologian, who says that reason is a harmful whore, and that we should, blind it by, throwing dirt at it. And what I like about this quote is that, Luther was a prolific author, and he wrote, thousands and thousands of arguments. He was using his reason all the time. So what I think that illustrates is the discomfort we feel when we are exposed to arguments that challenge our views. And so the very fact that we feel this discomfort, it shows that our reasoning abilities were able to evaluate the arguments and to recognize them as being good. Like if someone gives you a bad argument for something, then you don't mind. It's like, well, no, just your view is just bad. But when someone gives you a good argument for a view you disagree with, you can't help but notice that, something I'm going to have to deal with. And in many cases, you find counter arguments, and so you can get away with not changing your mind. But still, it's there. Like you are able to recognize the quality of the arguments, even if they challenge your view.
Nice. I think it was 2007 or 2008. My first book had come out, and I had been invited to the University of Michigan to speak both on separate days on their psychology department and in their business school. It was the same talk. There wasn't much overlap in the audience. And so on a Thursday, I think I gave the talk at at the psychology department.
Psychology, yeah.
Yeah. And people were like, oh yeah, great. Applying evolutionary psychology to study consumer behavior, decision-making, beautiful. Yeah, makes sense. Exact same talk the next day at Ross School of Business. I couldn't finish a single sentence. The hostility was arguably the worst I had ever experienced, because this idea of applying biology to study consumers was completely insane. What are you?
I'm surprised by this. Yeah, wow.
Well, I think they've kind of come around a bit, but oh yeah, I faced a lot of hostility, believe me. And now the reason why I'm telling you that story is because, in a sense, speaking about open-mindedness and revising your opinions and so on, I noticed, it's anecdotal based on what happened that day. I don't have data to prove it, but certainly what happened was that the more junior the people were in the audience, the less resistant they were. The more senior the professors were, the more obnoxious and hostile they were. Now, it's very easy to explain that, because if you are coming from a I mean, you would understand this term, but let me just explain the SSSM model, the standard social science model, the social constructivist model. We're born tabula rasa. It's only socialization that makes us the consumers that we are. And if I vested my entire career in that framework, then here comes biology boy on his white horse. Well, he is threatening to me, even though technically I'm not threatening. We can certainly work together to have a better explanation for the phenomenon. And so they were quite hostile. Whereas the doctoral student who hadn't yet been vested for 20, 30 years in a particular paradigm were like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. So do you think that as what I just said, generally, the likelihood of my being anchored in my position is just a function of how long I've been committed to that position, no?
Yeah, no, it seems plausible. And clearly there are reasons to expect that it should be the case. Like the more people know you hold a position, the more you recognize as holding a position, the larger the social cost of changing your mind. But from a kind of purely kind of methodological point of view, the priors would also change. Like the doctoral students would have fewer priors, whereas the more kind of experienced faculty, they would also have acquired a lot of knowledge that they think confirms their view of the world. And so it's hard to tell whether it's the social thing or the priors changing. It's likely both,
Right.
but it might also have something to do with that. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, let's now segue to the more recent book, and then we'll get into intellectual humility. So in your most recent book, it's I love that term, epistemic vigilance, and then you also link it to gullibility. Give us the main theme of the book, and then we can jump from there.
So again, starting from an evolutionary point of view, there's this kind of well-established now theory of the evolution of communication. And one of the predictions of that theory is that within any communicating organisms, whether they're kind of within the same species or across species, both the individuals that send the information and the individuals that receive the information should benefit from it. And the reasoning behind this is very simple, is that if as a sender of information you don't benefit, then you stop sending, and as a receiver of information, if you don't benefit, you stop receiving. And so both of them should benefit. The issue is that if you're not, talking about cells in an organism, or maybe kind of bees in a beehive that have pretty much kind of aligned genetic interests, then you will have conflicts. So even within a family, the interests, like the fitness interests, are not perfectly overlapping, and as a result of that, there will be conflicts. And so even if you're a child, you can't just believe everything your parents tell you, because some of these things will be in their interest and not necessarily in yours. And so what that means is that it's going to be very hard in many cases for communication to work because of these diverging interests. And one way I think that humans manage to make it work is by having a suite of cognitive mechanisms that evaluate communication, so that we can both kind of reject communication that would be harmful to us, that would be kind of inaccurate, and accept the communication, the messages that tend to be more kind of beneficial to us. And so these are these kind of mechanisms of epistemic vigilance that I also call in the book kind of mechanisms of open vigilance, to show that they're not just about rejecting bad information, but also about being open enough to accept information that we think is going to be good for us.
Now, but so when you're talking about epistemic vigilance, let's see if I can put it in the context of one of the important tenets in evolutionary psychology, the domain's general mechanisms versus specific mechanisms. So I could be sharing information with you that inherently is in a domain general context. I'm telling you, whatever, you vote for this political candidate. It doesn't have a clear downstream effect to some evolutionarily relevant problem. On the other hand, in say intersex dynamics, where I'm a man who is trying to convince you, as if I'm speaking to a woman, that I will be forever loyal to you and I'm going to be committed to you. But clearly I may have duplicitous intent, and you as the woman has to be able to see to gauge whether I'm truthful or not. In that case, to use your term, the vigilance is very much rooted in a domain specific calculus versus the former example, which was a domain general one. Do you look at epistemic vigilance across these two ways of talking about things?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first, we think that epistemic vigilance is domain specific to the extent that it is restricted to communicated information. And it seems as if we can, it seems obvious, but we don't apply it, at least not spontaneously, to stuff that we perceive. So, if I think that my colleague John is in his office and you tell me actually John is at home, I might not believe you. I might think, no, I mean, I just saw him in his office, you must be wrong. Whereas if I see that John is actually at home, then I will change my mind immediately. I will trust my perception and I will revise my memory will change. So we only apply epistemic vigilance spontaneously to stuff that other people tell us, which is a very narrow kind of restricted type of information, even though it's it can be about just about anything. But the point you're making a very good point. So epistemic vigilance, these mechanisms, they will take into account a number of cues to figure out whether you should change your mind or not. Some of them will relate to the content of the information. Is it something that's plausible? Others will relate to the source of the information. Okay, are you knowledgeable about the topic at hand? Are you, do you have reliable information? And one of the main cue that we take into account is what are your interests? What are your incentives? And so if I believe that you have an incentive to lie to me, that you can benefit from lying to me, then I will be much more careful than if I think that your incentives are perfectly aligned with mine. And so that's where all of these mechanisms that are more kind of domain specific in the classical sense that you've mentioned will come into play. So if you're in this kind of mating situation, or kind of potential mating situation, you know that the man might try to get you in bed, and and vice versa. So it's just you have an idea of if you're playing poker, you know that you can distrust your closest friends because the incentives within poker are to just to beat you, and that's it. And so we're very good at taking these incentives into account, and clearly some of the cues that we use to do this are kind of some of these domain specific mechanisms having to do with coalitions and mating and our understanding of kind of the social life more generally.
Beautiful. Do you look at whether evolutionarily relevant peripheral cues, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by that, whether they might impact my ability to be epistemically vigilant or not? So let me give you an example of this big word mouthful that I just said. I am good looking or I'm not. I am tall or I'm not. So to the extent that, let's say, women would prefer a taller guy, or whether I'm good looking or not, will those evolutionary relevant, and I say peripheral cues because they're not really central to the argument that I'm making when I'm trying to convince you of something, right? So if I'm trying to push a particular idea to you, whether I'm good looking or not should not affect the veracity of that idea. But yet, my God, this guy is gorgeous. The beauty premium, he must be correct, right? We know that there's the beauty premium. We know that there's a height premium in the labor market. So does my ability to trigger my epistemic vigilance change as a function of these otherwise irrelevant cues?
So in principle, I would think not.
I would think yes.
Yeah, no. I was thinking. So I mean, I think I'm very much kind of like a modularist type of person. So my thinking would be, the mechanisms that tell you whether a source is reliable or not should not take these cues into account because they are not statistically correlated, with being competent or being knowledgeable necessarily. But at least when it comes to not holding beliefs, but to expressing beliefs, clearly we want to ingratiate ourselves with people who are, more, good looking, more powerful, more, who have a better kind of social situation. And so we might be more likely to say that we accept something that comes from someone who is, socially desirable in a number of ways. But I would still think that in terms of, there should be your mind, I mean, it might be unconscious, but your mind should be able to differentiate these two things. Like, do you accept the belief or not? And then do you kind of publicly assent to it? And it's a fine, and that, once you've publicly assented to it, then it you might be committed to it and act on that basis, and it can engender a number of things. But I would still hope that your mind should be able to distinguish between these two things.
But when you say that, I hope that your mind will be able to distinguish, they're not statistically correlated. It sounds, if you forgive me for saying, what sort of the classical economists do with the axioms of rational choice in behavioral decision making, where they say, well, this is how you ought to behave if you're a normative rational person. So it from an ecological rationale perspective, it actually seems to me that I can argue that it doesn't matter that there isn't the statistical correlation that you are basing your argument on, because I'm precisely a creature that does fall prey to these peripheral cues, right? And this is why I look to how tall a president is, and that's a better predictor of whether I choose him or not than all of the policy decisions that he makes. We fall captive.
No, that's not true. Yeah. I mean, that's not the case. I mean,
What's not the case?
I mean, otherwise people would always vote, like 90% of the
No,
people
no,
would
of
vote for the
course.
tallest president. So
No, but
so
for
yeah.
example, just for you, I mean, I'm sure you probably heard this example. I think when Bush and Kerry were going against each other, Bush's team had all of these
Yeah,
conditions,
that's
right?
try to
That
make
so
him
that
look
he doesn't look short. So clearly, they do think that it's something to be managed and perceptually, right?
Yeah, but the fact that they think it should be managed doesn't mean it has, a huge impact. But I mean, it might have a very small impact at the margin. I'm not, saying otherwise. But still, I mean, so evolutionarily, if someone is going to tell you, look, that mushroom is poisonous or that mushroom is edible, if you're listening more to tall people, even though they don't know more about mushrooms, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, right, sure.
And so you might say, well, okay, no, maybe if the guy is really absolutely handsome and you don't want to antagonize him, you might say, oh, no, that mushroom looks great, and then you just don't eat it later on. But you should still be able to know that whether what he's telling you is true or not.
So I wonder if this may be an opportunity for a future collaboration. Could it be that the likelihood of my succumbing to peripheral cues is very much moderated by different domains that the information is coming from, right? So in the mushroom case, maybe the tall and good looking doesn't matter, but in other situations, I can imagine that its effect will be much greater.
Yeah, possibly, or it should depend a lot on how, whether you're testing like the belief itself and its behavioral consequences, or more just the social consequences of stating the belief. I think that would be, but it might be kind of tricky to manipulate, but not impossible.
Right, got you. Okay, let's move on to intellectual humility. I just did a clip on my show where I had just come across in sort of in preparation for our chat. I kind of did a deep dive into the research on intellectual humility, and I came across a paper by Leary et al. 2017, which I'm presuming that you obviously know that paper.
Possibly, yeah. You might have to remind me.
Oh, it's a paper where they looked at one of several things. I think they had 4 studies, one of which was core. So there was a psychometric measurement of intellectual humility, and then they correlated it with, I think, 4 personality traits. One was openness. People who are more open are more likely to be intellectually humble. They correlated with curiosity. They correlated with tolerance for ambiguity and low dogmatism. And then in a subsequent set of studies, so I'll just mention one, they showed that people who are intellectually humble would be less likely to ascribe a flip-flopping characteristic to a politician who changed his or her opinion, because they recognize that.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, so I thought, okay, well, we could talk about that, and then situated in the context of your recent 2023 paper on intellectual humility. But before I do that, I want to motivate our conversation by telling a story that I recount in the first chapter of The Parasitic Mind. This is a conversation that I was having with a family member. Out of respect for the person, I never mention who it is, but if they're listening, they'll know who they are. This is a situation where this person was telling me, oh, God, those ancient Greeks, yeah, I mean, those Christians, they were really anti-Semitic. And I said, well, actually, my apologies, I don't mean to correct you, but they weren't Christians. He said, no, what do you mean? Greeks, they're Christians. I said, well, as a matter of fact, the way we record the period is BC. BC is before Christ. So by definition, historically, we know they weren't not Christian. It's incontrovertible. When that person realized that there was no way to get out of it, then that person answered, right, I said that they weren't Christian and you said that they were. So it's the ultimate form, forgive the I hope it doesn't offend you, it's an ultimate form of mind fuck, right? Because that person is so intellectually lacking in humility. There are actually words for it in Arabic, which is my mother tongue, that even though that person is telling you that, they know that you know that they're lying.
And yet,
no, I'm the one who said. So that's I think, a perfect anecdote to speak against the antithesis of intellectual humility. Take it away wherever you want to go with this.
No, I mean, it is really interesting, and I think it highlights something that relates to our paper that you mentioned there, which stresses the social component of intellectual humility, or kind of, or arrogance. It's opposite, and the fact that in some, depending on the context, either intellectual humility or, on the contrary, intellectual arrogance can be socially beneficial. So in most contexts, I think being intellectually humble sort of pays out, because, if you're careful in your pronouncements, if you avoid being overconfident, if you listen to advice, if you do all of these things that more intellectually humble people tend to do, people will tend to like you more. As a rule, they will respect your efforts and your integrity. But in other contexts, clearly kind of appearing more kind of dominant is gonna pay off. There are, it's maybe a little bit more true among men, but clearly there are contexts in which you just want to show that you're strong and you're dominant. And in these contexts, being intellectually arrogant can be a way of doing that, saying, no, I'm right, and that's the way it is a way of kind of asserting your authority. And it can be, socially beneficial, at least in the sense that it's, it can be, at least you can think it's useful for you to be perceived as being dominant. So our point is that a lot of the, I mean, plausibly, maybe some of the reasons why we are sometimes intellectually humble and in other cases more intellectually arrogant have to do with the social benefits or costs of being one or the other.
Gotcha. Well, now, intellectual humility could be very much related to sort of the earlier quote of Festinger, in light of incoming evidence that disproves my long-standing and cherished position, I'm humble enough to change it. So that's kind of one way we could look at intellectual humility. The other way that I've often used the term, not in the psychometric sense of how, it might be measured, but I often argue that the reason why I don't get nearly in as much trouble as otherwise you might think, given all of the public pronouncements that I make, oftentimes with great assuredness on very thorny topics, is because I think I'm very well modulated about what I know and what I don't know. And that's another way, I think, to measure intellectual humility. So to go back to our earlier term, nomological networks of cumulative evidence, if I have built the requisite network in support of my position, and you'd like to debate me, good luck to you. I'm going to walk into that room with all of the swagger, the intellectual swagger of someone who really is confident about what I'm talking about. I'm not posing, I'm not posturing, I'm just really confident. On the other hand, the reason why I don't get into trouble in very, very high profile settings is because if you were to ask me, hey, what is the net effect so far of the legalization of marijuana in Canada? And I will say, that's a great question, but unfortunately, it's way above my pay grade. I don't know enough about this. I haven't built the nomological network. And therefore, you could never really catch me having bullshitted in a public forum, because I'm very well modulated about what I know and don't know. Which do both of these definitions of intellectual humility apply in your work? Capacity to change my position in light of incoming information, and the modulation that I spoke of, the Confucius way of thinking?
No, completely. I think that the second ability you're referring to would be something that, as many psychologists would call that kind of metacognition.
Yeah.
The ability to know, whether you're right or not, and whether, in your case in particular, not only whether you're right or not, but whether you have, good arguments to defend your point of view or not. And indeed, I think a lot of people who work on intellectual humility agree that being well calibrated metacognitively, sort of knowing when you know something or when you don't, is a crucial element. The argument that these people make usually is that, or some of them make anyway, is that it's not sufficient to be intellectually humble, in the sense that if you're a mathematics professor at Princeton or something, and you're dealing with people who don't know anything about math, if you're extremely boastful and you brag a lot, and it's like, look, you're stupid and you don't know anything about math, and I'm one of the best people in the world at math, even if it's true, you're still being an asshole and you're not being intellectually humble. So it's not purely a matter of metacognitive kind of accuracy or calibration, but there's also this kind of social component of not being boastful, even of things that are true.
Beautiful. Let's move on to EP in general. So I guess question one, how long have you now been since out of your PhD? 15 years about?
Yeah, in 2009, so yes, just short of 15, yeah.
Okay. Have you seen a growing acceptance within behavioral scientists in general of the EP framework, or are we still fighting the exact same battles that we did?
I think, but it might be because I tend to be an optimistic person. I think we've seen some progress in the sense that not necessarily kind of acceptance of kind of high church, Santa Barbara, to be in Cosmides type EP has grown necessarily, but at least kind of weaker forms of just taking some evolutionary arguments into account, or feeling as if you have to have some kind of evolutionary rationale for your theories. Things are, I think, becoming more common, and I think to some extent, like a strong antipathy is turning into just people not caring that much about it, to be honest. So, for instance, in the field of reasoning, which I I know quite well, I think there was some antipathy to anything that would have been evolutionary, that was true, as you know better than I do, across the social sciences, and so they had inherited that view that was kind of anti-evolution. And now I think that they're not opposed to it, but they don't really care that much about it either. They don't feel as if they have to have some plausible evolutionary rationale for their theories. They
Okay.
just don't discount anything that is evolutionary. They just don't really care that much about it. So it's a form of progress, I guess.
Right. Right.
And then hopefully at some point then we'll get them to realize that it's really important to think that way. And so yeah, but I don't know what's your take. Do you think things are going better or?
I think so. I think that the regrettable part is that there is a set of cognitive and emotional obstacles that will always be there, irrespective of how much progress there is. Because I can't remember who said it. I don't know if it was Bus or someone, that some of these cognitive and emotional obstacles are inherently themselves evolutionary based, so that it is almost an indelible part of reasoning for people to view some of these evolutionary explanations with some suspicion. But I do think at a field level, at the epistemological level, I'd like to think that there is less resistance. If only I use my own career as a exemplar. Hugo, arguably my favorite quote of all time, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to butcher it. I'm going to paraphrase it. Is one by JBS Haldane, whom I'm sure you know who that is. So he's got this quote where he's talking about the 4 cognitive stages that scientists go through before they accept a theory. And stage 1, yeah, this is bullshit, this is garbage. Well, this may be true, but it's perverse point of view. Stage 3, well, this is true, but largely unimportant. What's the actionable? It's nonsense.
Yeah.
Stage 4, oh, I always said so. Well, right? And so it's a perfect example of these reasoning arguments at the scientific level. And I always argue that, if I were ever to be presumptuous enough to think that people care about me writing an autobiography of my scientific career, that quote would be the entire book, because it captures my life. I still have emails, Hugo, because I'm an email hoarder, from people who were at stage 1 when they first responded, and then they're at stage 4. Dear God, we would be honored to have you come. I'm like, oh, but what happened to I'm a complete bullshitter, perverse idiot, imbecile. So I'd like to think that we are changing, but I think there's a lot more work to do. Do you think that, so if I try to situate the French ecosystem in terms of their acceptance or antipathy towards evolutionary psychology, where would they fit on that arc? Are they more pro? Are they less? How to say compared to England?
Well, so traditionally England has always been kind of a hotbed of adaptationism. And so they had this tradition that was very strong, and it's very strong in kind of behavioral ecology and in kind of in ethology. And so it might have helped with some acceptance of evolution in the social sciences. In France, unfortunately, evolution by natural selection, since it was the Brits that had invented that, and they had proven Laplace wrong. It was Lamarck, no, not Laplace, right? Lamarck, obviously, they had proven
Yeah.
Lamarck wrong. It was very bad, and they're still, until 30, 40 years ago, kind of great French thinkers who are trying to prove that Darwin sort of not wrong, but one of these things. Oh, actually, it was natural evolution by natural selection should be rethought. Blah blah blah. So France is not well situated for that. And so that's relates to one of the questions that I think you're going to ask me at some point. So when I first encountered evolutionary psychology was by reading the French translation of How the Mind Works by Steve Pinker, Comment fonctionne
Oh,
l'esprit,
yes. Okay.
and which was an absolutely kind of awesome book. And that was also my first exposure to evolution by natural selection. Like I was in college. And so I had never really in my school year had been exposed or sufficiently exposed to the idea of evolution by natural selection, which I kind of fell in love with immediately. And so in France, I think evolution by natural selection on the whole is not something that people stress. I mean, there are a few kind of amazing, biologists doing very, very good work in that area, but on the whole, I think the French ecosystem is a bit, it's not something that they really love. And so that got transposed to the applications of evolution in the social sciences. I don't know if it was worse than the US or in other places, but it was not better.
But I'm asking you here to speculate. We don't know for sure, but do you think the fact that some of the holy dispensers of postmodernist bullshit all come from France, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, the rest of the gang, could it be that because it's a hotbed of postmodernism, there are no absolute truths, everything is relative? Now here comes the evolutionist thinking, of course there is a universal human universe. Could that contribute partly to why some of the evolutionary stuff did not get picked up in France?
Plausibly, yeah. And France is I think, I guess, for structural reasons, intellectual changes happen relatively maybe slowly in France. And for instance, psychoanalysis is still important. Yeah. Also in Argentina, I think the two countries in the world in which
Right.
So it's one of the things when they did not beat us. And and so because of this inertia, it's possible that we're taking even more time than other countries. But things are also progressing mostly in the good direction. Like for instance, if I think of my advisor Dan Sperber, who is an anthropologist by training, but who got interested quite quickly in a cognitive and then kind of evolutionary approach. For a long time, he didn't even want to take on PhD students because he knew they would be doomed, like they could never find a job in France because it was completely impossible. Whereas things are very slowly changing in the right direction, and now like all of his PhD students, when he finally got some, we're all working together. We have positions, so we're it's a small-ish country, so a few people make a significant difference.
Amazing. Well, for the listeners who may not know, I mean, Hugo mentioned that it's How the Mind Works. That was his epiphany into EP and evolution in general. For me, it was Homicide by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. It was a first semester doctoral course I did my PhD at Cornell, and my supervisor, who's a cognitive psychologist by training, asked me to, or suggested that I take a course in advanced social psychology. It wasn't an EP course. And about halfway through the semester, the professor in question, his name is Dennis Regan, assigned Homicide. And for those of you who don't know, Homicide is a book by two of the pioneers of EP, whereby they demonstrate that certain patterns of criminality happen in very clear reasons because of evolutionary, causes. And I mean, it was like a thunderbolt hit me, because I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that there is such an elegant and parsimonious way to explain all this. And then that's how I decided, okay, well, I'm going to apply this framework in consumer behavior and so on. And, it's funny because I've had both on my show and just in private talking to several, evolutionary psychologists, and they all can point to sort of an episodic memory where so there's really something quite beautiful about the fact that we can all point to that's what it was. Any comments about that?
No, but I think it's really, I mean, I don't want to compare, either kind of homicide or even how the mind works to that, but a lot of mathematicians or even scholars, more generally physicists, recall being first exposed, especially from older times, being first exposed to Euclid's Elements and
Yeah,
having the first exposure to mathematical proof and being they're having their minds completely blown
yeah.
by the idea that you can have a mathematical proof that is perfectly demonstrative. And so it's quite this kind of these epiphanies are quite often reported in the history of science. So I don't want to compare myself to Einstein or anybody, obviously, but it does happen, and I think it's a good sign. It means that there is an idea then that, okay, no, this is, we have this ability to recognize good ideas, and what I think are good anyway, and then to kind of build on that, and it's quite striking, yeah.
Well, and I love, I mean, so right now we're talking about how we as researchers were first exposed and had our mind blown. But if I may say, and I'm sure you can have similar stories, I get as much thrill, if not more thrill, when now I
The
am the
students, yeah.
one who is serving as the epiphany to a student who comes back to me 5 years later and says, I just had a fight with my wife, and I remember your lecture on the evolutionary roots of jealousy, and it was exactly what you talked about in
Yeah,
the Davis bus study. There's
yeah.
something quite magical about that, right?
No, I agree. I mean, I guess, fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know, to mostly teach quite advanced students, and so I'm rarely the first person to expose them to
Oh,
these kind
right.
of ideas, unfortunately. But I can still see them, when you give them a new example of a nice, evolutionary piece of reasoning that explains things neatly, when things fall into place, as you were describing when you read Homicide, and it is pleasant, yeah.
Uh, have you had, so going back to our earlier conversation about people changing their opinions, have you, in your personal interactions with fellow colleagues, have had people who were greatly and exhibited great animus towards EP, and now they're fully on the EP train?
That's a good question. None come to mind right now because I guess in the ecosystem I grew up in, people were already somewhat EP compatible because they had self-selected into that ecosystem, that
Right.
small ecosystem. But there might be some that I don't recollect. Yeah.
Okay. Two more questions and then we can wrap it up. First question, where do you see some of the most fertile areas of EP being? And before you answer, so you could say, yeah, but there's still tons of stuff to do in mating. There's still tons of stuff to do on the menstrual cycle and so on. So you can give an answer at that granular level or a broader level, anything you want. What are some of the exciting stuff coming up in EP in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, hopefully, applications to cultural evolution will develop more. So there's, this somewhat separate field of cultural evolution. And within that field of cultural evolution, there are kind of broadly two schools, one based in the US and one based kind of in Paris with, Dan and some of our colleagues here. And the American school, where that dominates the field, tends to be mostly or kind of somewhat agnostic about psychology. And it's not the social science, standard science model, but psychology would be, you have a few broad heuristics. I'm simplifying too much, but whereas we think that really understanding the detail of cognitive mechanisms and their evolved function is really crucial to understand how culture works and what cultural elements will be more successful. And so I think that reinforcing this interaction between countercultural evolution and evolutionary psychology is something that is going to be very exciting over the next couple of decades. Yeah.
So where would you situate the Joe Henricks, the dual inheritance model folks? They're all fitting under the
The
non-French
American,
model, the
yeah,
American.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, got you. I mean, if I were to answer my own question, I think some of
Hmm.
the exciting areas in the next 10 and 20 years will be applications of EP in discipline. So whether it be, I apply it in the business school, in
Hmm.
economics or consumer behavior, whether you apply it in law, whether you apply it in, I think those might be some of the, because yes, of course, there's always going to be interesting new stuff to discover about mating behavior and its evolutionary roots. I'm not saying we've covered everything, but it'll be a plus delta. Whereas
Hmm.
sort of going into
Yeah.
a new field that's never been touched or very, very rarely been touched by an EP lens, and now Darwinizing that field, I think that's where you're going to get some of your biggest bang for your buck. What do you think?
No, I completely agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. What are some projects that you are currently working on that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote? Take it away, Hugo.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm working on it's a very kind of, I guess, introspective project. I'm working on kind of intellectuals and what motivates scientists and philosophers and mathematicians to do what they do, because within an evolutionary perspective, it all seems like really kind of bizarre behavior to be obsessing over, the proof of, Fermat's last conjecture, or, or even like the evil function of whatever cognitive mechanism. Like, it doesn't seem to make much sense. And then from the point of view of cultural evolution, science also is very bizarre, because most of the products of science are extremely boring to just about everybody in the world except 10 people. So it seems as if the two disciplines I think have the most promise, in the social senses, are evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution. And it seems as if science, contradicts both of them. And so I'm going to try to see how everything can be reconciled.
Can I offer a possible
Please.
explanation?
Yeah.
So in my, and forgive me, I don't mean to engage in a shameless plug of my own work, but in
Yeah.
my next book that's coming out in July is a book on, well, it's called actually The Saad Truth About Happiness. Eight ways to lead a lead a good life and so on. In one of the chapters, which I call Life as a Playground, I basically argue that there are many things that seem austere and in cases somber, where you really benefit from viewing them as a form of play. So let's take an extreme example. I grew up in the Lebanese Civil War, which can't get much more somber than that. And yet the desire to play was there. There's even a great book on how in the Holocaust people would play. I mean, the prisoners would engage in play. Now let's link it to what you're doing. Well, I argue that science and intellectual pursuits is the ultimate form of play, right? And so if you were to ask me to be part of your study and you say, well, why do you do why you do? I would say, well, I'm a purist and I just love to pursue truth, and I'm just a playful guy, right? So I'm always thinking about linking. It's fun, right? I can't believe
no, it is exactly. Yeah, it is. But why we find it fun is kind of, I guess there are many forms of play, and it's interesting why for some of us, because it's not quite universal, but for some of us, we find doing science so enjoyable.
But in your, I don't know how far you are in this project, are you looking at the play motive as one explanation for why intellectuals?
I haven't considered that. No, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about curiosity more generally. But no, it's true. I mean, the play angle is really interesting, and I'll have to think about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, of course. Hugo, what a pleasure to speak to you. Yesterday, I was talking to a friend of mine a very good friend of mine, who's a clinical psychologist by training. Actually, he's a cross-cultural clinical psychologist at my university. And he was telling me, oh, who are some guests you've got coming up? And I said, oh, tomorrow I'm speaking to Hugo Mercier. And if it means anything to you, he was incredibly impressed and excited that I was.
Well, that's very flattering. Thank you.
So pleasure talking to you. Please come back.
It is great.
Anytime again. Thank you so much. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Cheers.
Bye.